I'm Caroline Ashley, the Global Director of our programmes at Forum for the Future. So I will talk about where we are now, but first of all, let's ask who we are. Let's just check who's in the room and get you into the practice of polls. I'm sure you're all used to polls by now in our Zoom life. But Maria, if we can start the first poll, could I just ask people to take 30 seconds to fill in what kind of organisation you are from? And if you're not from an organisation independent, you're welcome to put other. And if we have left something important out of other, you're welcome to put it in the chat because we don't have a comment function in here. And more than half of you have already done it. Thank you for that. Just a few people left. I guess some of the people not answering might be people like me from Forum. So Eduardo, thank you for that. We can, yeah, you'd count as advisory consultancy. So very interesting. Nearly half of us in the room are from businesses, from companies that engage directly in the edible fats and oils value chain. We have 10% from companies that are outside that chain, and a good chunk from non-profit and research. I know it's always a problem to put those together, but they overlap so much. And then no one from government, some advisory and some others. So thank you very much. So as expected, this is quite a business-focused, business-minded conversation. Actually, good point. I am seeing this slide, but Maria, is everyone seeing the slide? And if not, can you click it so that everyone is seeing it? I can see the results myself. I'm not sure if others can.
Let me just try and share those.
Actually, I can click share results. Oh.
I think anyway, that should be working now.
Okay, so I've given the results verbally anyway, so thank you. Let me now introduce where we are in this edible fats and oils sector. Industry, moment of change, transition. There are so many ways of thinking about it. If we go to the next slide, there are some very long-standing, very familiar issues. I mean, palm was really hitting the headlines for decades, not years, with the whole problem of deforestation. You can see here a classic example of the problem of deforestation, the lonely orangutan, the boycotts, the petitions. That's how palm is very well known internationally, I think. Apart from the environmental obvious deforestation issues, there are labour rights issues also well known in the value chain. This photo is actually from ILO. It's not just the campaigning NGOs that talk about it. But there's also, of course, a whole range of different types of edible fats and oils. And there's a recognition that they're incredibly important for keeping going and for health. They are indeed essential for all of us, animals and humans, and keeping us going. And there's a lot of flurry and controversy about health and ill health and good health and bad health and nutrition and so on. And there are so many different types of fats and oils. There's also a real interrelation between them, which we're going to come to in our conversation today. And this bottom chart shows the prices, how they have changed in recent months. And that, of course, is partly a reflection of the war, but it also shows how interrelated they are. It's got 4 of the main oils on here, and they're all sort of going up, following a trend together. So looking back in time, in decades, there have been these huge issues around health, consumption, and around supply in terms of environment and labour rights. If we move on now to what's been happening this year, it feels like it's almost a decade in a whole year. This has been such a turbulent year. Of course, the war in Ukraine, not only, as The Economist puts it so nicely in this little extract, not only affected the big black stuff, the real oil, and the oil price rocketed, but slightly more slowly, but then pretty dramatically has affected sunflower oil, with the Russia and Ukraine being the 2 biggest producers. And that in turn has ricocheted around the other edible fats and oils in the system. We saw Indonesia ban the export temporarily of all palm oil products, crude and refined, due to shortages in their own country. We saw Malaysia palm industry really struggling with a lack of labour to yield the crop. And then we are beginning to see the impacts of climate change. And the heat wave, I was living through the heat wave in Europe this year, the heat wave in Spain hit olive oil production there really dramatically. So if we knew that turbulence was coming, this is the year when I think it's become not a thing about, oh, it will come. It's like, this is how we have to now live in our sector. Turbulence is the name of the game. And that's a really important backdrop for our conversation today, because we don't have the answers, but also it would almost be irrelevant to have an answer or the answer, because the dynamic of the situation means we need a way of approaching the system, and we need a way of approaching solutions that is going to be dynamic. And just one point I want to reinforce is it's easy to be polarized between companies that think this is so important and non-profits and campaigners that are so critical. Now, I'm really well aware that fats and oils are just essential. I started off my career in what we used to call international development, and I would go and talk to low-income people about money they were earning from cooperatives or sewing projects or whatever. And I'd always say, what are you spending your new wages on, your increased income? And invariably, people would answer salt, soap, and oil. And it's really stayed with me. This was a long time ago. The essentials that people wanted to spend their cash on, soap, of course, includes oil, and cooking oil is a real fundamental thing that people couldn't grow on their own farm. They didn't have the processed oil. So the importance of it to humans is easy to forget in this debate. And we will be looking at the turbulence in the sector in the context of that essential debate. So just to frame onto the next slide, what do we think we're aiming for? Where do we think we're trying to get to? And of course, minimizing harm is essential. And RSPO was actually founded in 2004, so almost 2 decades ago. And the original emphasis was very much on there is harm happening, there are negative impacts, we need to deal with that. Fine, minimizing harm essential, but definitely not enough. So moving on again, it's almost 10 years ago that at Forum for the Future, we founded a project called the Net Positive Project. We just go to the next slide. We thought net positive was pretty ambitious, and a range of companies joined us 10 years ago, and now this has become mainstream, I'd say, in the last 2 years. The idea that you don't just do no harm, you don't even just reach net zero, which of course is huge and essential, but you need to put something more back in than you take out. And that's why a lot of restoration work is happening. But now we don't think that's enough. And if we go on to the next slide, we think that the systems around us are struggling so much that even just maintaining where we are now and repairing a bit of damage isn't going to be enough. We need another system that is reconfiguring living systems, that's social systems and environmental systems. And the name of this game isn't output or productivity or consumption or just well-being, well, important as well-being is, but it's something about thriving and enabling systems to reach their potential. We name this a just and regenerative world. And of course, it's not a fixed thing. It is dynamic because it enables all systems to thrive and reach their potential. So our contention in Palm is that we need to move beyond the do no harm. We need to move beyond, do some positive with some replenishment, replanting, and ask the question today, given the turbulence, which in some ways makes things harder, but in some ways makes things easier, how can we actually reconfigure the whole system? Because it is disruptive and because things are so interrelated in this sector. So in summary, before I hand over to Carrie, if we move to the next slide, we know that edible fats and oils are essential, but also have some damaging impacts. So we can't live without them, but we have to deal with the negatives. Incredibly complicated, just touched on a fraction of what's going on, and very interrelated. There's a lot of possible substitutions going on. Hugely disrupted already and not going to be static, going to be disrupted even more. So the question for today is, how do we create that future for edible fats and oils that equitably benefits and sustainably meets the needs of people and planet? That's dealing with the impacts, but also isn't just a static thing. It's future fit, it's flexible, it's nimble, and it's truly serving just and regenerative outcomes. So that's the context for our conversation. We're going to hear from Carrie now, and then from some of our panelists, and then we'll have more discussion and questions. So Carrie, over to you.
We have a small poll first.
Oh, sorry, we do. Let's find your opinion first. The second question, your first one was just a practice. So Mary, if we can put the poll up again, before you've heard all the wonderful discussion, where's your head at now? If we keep pushing the frontiers of sustainability, which of these are you currently thinking about? Radical innovation in value chains, enhancing traceability, or focusing on regulation? Yes, Pendle, I agree with your comment. Our line is very much that we should be going for regeneration, but we're trying to frame a question to see where people are currently at. The numbers are still going up. Thank you everyone for answering. Just give it another 30 seconds. Okay, any last answers? This is really interesting. It's pretty much a tie between radical innovation in value chains and enhancing supply chain traceability, 41% each, and then 19% saying increase or implement regulation. So no clear answer there, a divided room, but that's exactly what we want, because the point of our conversation today is to get different perspectives. So thank you everyone for the poll. And now I really will hand over to Carrie to hear more about the in-depth thinking and the findings.
Thanks, Caroline. So we're here today as kind of the culmination of the collaboration that's been in existence for a few years now. Breaking Down Fats and Oils report, which I'm going to talk about, was developed and authored by a collaboration which began in 2015 with VOLAC's here today, and with Aurum, and with 5 other members joining in subsequent years, including M&S and IUCN, who are also joining us today, as well as Upheld, Unilever and WWF. So before recent disruptions brought to light how connected the oil sector is, the collaboration was starting to look holistically across different fats and oils as a system. And in 2019 published a case for action outlining the anticipated drivers of change and identifying areas for collaborative action. But one of the key things that they kept coming back to was there was no clear way to compare different fats and oils holistically. And so this report was developed as a result of that discussion and that previous report. So next slide, please. The key point, no, that one, thank you. The key point is that the report provides centralised information about sustainability and nutritional profiles of edible fats and oils, bringing those together. It helps decision makers in the food industry to make better informed policy, sourcing and investment decisions. That's what we want it to be used for. Please do use it. We're ultimately aiming to accelerate the sustainable production and use of edible fats and oils. It's broken down into sections, and I'm just going to talk about a few parts of it. So the next slide, please. So what we're talking about? We're talking about 9 oils in this report. So it analyses the major vegetable oils and animal fats consumed globally by production volume as one system, which seems to be the first time it had been done. So this covers food uses of oils, not wider uses, so cooking, spreading, baking and processed food production. And there's little widespread understanding about how these industrially used fats and oils stack up against each other, environmentally, socially, nutritionally. And often public debate is really simplified and polarised. Good or bad fats, that's whether for the environment or people. Palm often receives the most scrutiny, particularly because of deforestation and other environmental impacts. But just focusing on one oil and one issue can create unintended consequences in the wider system. So this report aims to counter that by providing a balanced description of these 9 major oils. No single crop holds all the answers to these multiple and complex challenges Caroline's been talking about. So we need to look at the whole system and try and respond adequately and, in the right way for the future, for a regenerative future. So Caroline's mentioned some of these issues, and this report pays attention to many of them, highlighting the relevance for each oil, whether it's environmental issues, could be land use change, water depletion, soil health, could be social issues such as workers' rights or rights of Indigenous people. Animal welfare pops up as well, obviously, as an important thing when you're talking about animal fats. And also financial issues, could be reputational risk to a company and financial impact from that. Why are fats and oils so important? Well, because of health and well-being, they're really important. They provide us with energy, they help us absorb many other nutrients. Not eating a balanced diet with the right type and levels of fats can add to the triple burden of malnutrition, whether that's underweight, overweight, or hidden hunger through micronutrient deficiency. Soybean and palm oil are among 8 ingredients which provide 85% of the world's calories, so it's really critical. We go on to the next slide. So markets, trade, it's really important as well. Edible fats and oils are a large and growing global market and critical to some economies. I mean, this growth is driven by the use of vegetable oils in the food industry, particularly in countries with growing populations, increased growth for use in biofuel industry, as well as greater awareness of the health properties of vegetable oils. So, for example, looking at data on this slide, in Indonesia and Malaysia, you can see they produce a huge amount of the world's palm oil, 80%, a total of 4.5 million people working in the palm oil sector. So the global market for vegetable oils is anticipated to grow by about 3.3% between 2020 and 2027. So it's really significant. So many factors also determine how we use these oils, and this is talked about in the report too. And therefore, how easy it is to substitute oils. You know, if you can't use oil, you have to pivot away from an oil. You want to make your decisions based on environment and social factors. It's not straightforward. We talk about functionality, whether that's texture or smoke point, cultural acceptance and taste preferences, nutritional profiles, local regulatory landscapes, for example, policies on sourcing palm, reputation, for example, relating to environmental and social factors, and also price. We can't forget about price. The next slide, please. So we are looking to the future today, a different future, but there's already been innovation in this sector. Whether or not it's financially viable is another story. There's been a lot of investment in developing novel alternative oils, so algal, insect-derived, yeast, coffee, for example. But our food system's largely designed to produce cheap food, and cheap food includes growing vegetable oils cheaply. So there could be serious barriers to scaling up this production. So it's currently impossible to produce novel oils with similar properties to palm that's anywhere near as viable in cost. So we shouldn't lose sight of what we have and think how we can overcome issues with a silver bullet. Like, all parts of the system need to be looked at for future fit production and use, new and old. And some of these products might be able to use more in more sort of cosmetics or animal food, because the margins are often higher and regulatory barriers lower. So there's different things to think about when you're thinking about new, novel, alternative fats. So, and also with an increasing call to shifts in food production from land to lab to free up land for non-productive use, emerging solutions might start to come into these disruptive changes in the future. And moving on. So the report sets out comparable data sets, and this is where it gets really helpful. It's been designed to be really easy to look at a glance and see what's going on, to help decision makers, particularly to highlight the impacts of oil substitutions. So it includes the profile summaries of the nine oils and fats, as well as comparable data on functionality, yield per area, nutrition, life cycle impacts, etc. This enables an understanding of multiple factors and comparisons across the oils at a glance. So this is page 1 of the oils table, and the rest of the oils follow on the table here. And then moving on to the next slide. We also can compare environmental impacts against each other. So, you know, we just talked about palms often seen as really negative, but it has really high yield per area. And also some of its life cycle impacts are actually a lot lower than other crops, for example, olive oil. So it depends which different factors you're looking at, which is why it's so important to consider everything in the round. On the next slide, if we take palm as the example where it's been broken down into the individual oil to talk about, this is an individual profile in depth, highlighting statistics, nutrition and health components of production and consumption, global production figures, agrochemical inputs, primary and other uses of oils, as well as the key impacts for each oil. Some oils were also able to highlight signals of change to respond to. So if you just move through those slides, Mara, you can see more about the palm oil on the next slide. Here's where it's broken down into primary uses, other uses, production methods, and really picks out the key impacts for each oil in a very easy to use way. And on to the next, please. So, in the report, we had 7 key takeaways and insights which were highlighted in the report, as well as a call to action. And you can read these in detail in the report. That's your homework for after today, to go away and read it all. And our call to action is still relevant, but what comes next to be future fit? We need to jump forward with priorities and action, not dismissing the report, but building on it to meet future demand. So what does this future look like? So it's a very interconnected system. Further disruption is almost guaranteed, but we don't know how it's going to pan out. So we need to see policies and collaborative action extended beyond just palm and soy, which has been the focus so far. So we can have a real system-wide transformation. Developing new products or working across, alternatives really needs to work across sustainability, research and development, procurement teams, taking a holistic view in decision-making to avoid those unintended consequences. We need to go beyond just focusing on mitigating impacts and see how we can adapt to changing conditions. So beyond sustainable production, exploring the regenerative agricultural practices to support long-term resilience. And we won't just make change by focusing on shifting production practices, on new value chain models, better value distribution, and sustainable consumption, including reducing consumption. Thinking about nutritional outcomes. But what hasn't changed from the original report is we must tell the complicated truth, not a simple story. It's too easy to say one's good, one's bad. We need to get past that, past oversimplified messages, leading consumers to call for oversimplified solutions. So next slide, please. So we need to go beyond understanding impact hotspots, minimising negative impacts, and actively contribute to the soil and biodiversity recovery required for a just and regenerative future. Regenerative thinking starts from a different question about the potential of different fats and oils to contribute to that future, not just how we can make them a bit better, but what they can do. We need to look beyond like-for-like substitutions. For example, if more crops went directly to feed people, not through feeding animals, that's one thing that can help, but there are many, many ways that we can move forward. We have new examples coming through. Again, we're going to refer to palm because that's where work's taking place. There are pilots testing agroforestry and agroecological production models, polycropping with palm, cocoa, maize and cassava, growers transitioning to organic farming with dynamic agroforestry, smallholders trialling providing cash crops and growing sustenance crops for their families. Business like Nestle, Danone, L'Oreal, Unilever stepping forward and say they're investing in regeneration and regenerative plans in agriculture and agroforestry. So rediscovering and reimagining healthy production systems for palm oil casts a new light on what is possible when approaching the problem of deforestation with different mindset, but more oils and crops globally need to follow as well. The conventional approaches to decision making can only get us so far. So how does this renewed look at production also transfer up and through our actors in the value chain to the end consumer? How do we take all actors along in the necessary transformation? How can we drive greater change at pace and scale? And how can we encourage the adoption of new mindsets, skill sets and approaches critical to creating what's really needed, a truly just and regenerative future? So I would ask you to read, use, share the report and its intentions. Use it now in the context of a reimagined world, a future fit to meet global challenges that regenerates the soil and ecological functions we all depend upon, and those lives bound up in growing, processing, and getting food onto our tables. And so that's in a nutshell the report. And I'm going to hand over next and introduce our collaboration members who were involved in writing it. And in the development of the whole report. So we have Andy Richardson, who's Director of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability at VOLAC. We have Lucinda Langton, Head of Sustainability at M&S Food, and Helene van den Homburg, Senior Advisor Agro-Commodity Governance at IUCN Netherlands, and also Coordinator at the Collaborative Soy Initiative. So they are each going to talk to us about the topic and their role in the collaboration. And we're going to start with Andy. So I'm going to hand over to Andy.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you all. So my name's Andy Richardson, Director of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability at VOLAC, as you've just mentioned. I also chair the Food and Drink Board for the Welsh Government, and I sit on a couple of UK government groups, I guess, including Strategic Trade Advisory Group, which is very interesting. So what I want to talk about is a few things. Firstly, why I believe collaboration is really important. I've learned so much by working with Forum for the Future over the years. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about how those collaborations have been manifested, what the projects are that we worked with Forum, and then I'll summarize what I see as a real benefit. And I'm very conscious that there are those on this call who may or may not have done much collaboration and may or may not have worked with Forum. And by the way, if you haven't worked with Forum, try it. You'll really love it. I've learned so much. There you go. That's the advert. So for me, why collaborate? Well, I guess the key question is, what does effective collaboration look like? And the way I see it is like to sit in isolation and observe challenges that affect our businesses and organizations means your destiny is not in your hands. You're simply an observer. And ultimately, many businesses say they're leading businesses. Well, leading businesses and organizations do not just sit back and watch what's going on. For me, to be proactive and engage and collaborate with stakeholders is an issue that about issues that affect your business and your industry, means that fundamentally you can influence the future. You're ahead of your competitors, and actually people take you more seriously. And that's the one thing that I've learned from this is by being involved in the collaboration, people really respect you for doing it, and actually you have a dimension to the discussions that you can have with various stakeholders, including regulators. And for me, collaborating could be incredibly challenging. It's certainly been fascinating talking to people in the groups where you have totally diametric views, polarized views. But actually, the whole process of particularly the scenarios planning is very disarming. I don't want to mention individual companies, but some who have totally different beliefs, we got on really well with. And actually, ultimately, my view is when you actually really talk to people, 80% of the issues that people believe in are actually shared. It's only the 20% that we disagree. So for me, the logic is work on the 80% and make progress rather than fight over the 20% we don't agree. So I think the final comment on that is it frustrated me enormously that people have very strong opinions. And someone mentioned it earlier on in this conference that people take positions, and ultimately taking positions doesn't make progress, and it isn't collaborative, and we do not make progress. So in terms of reflections on collaborations, let me tell you a story about the work I've done with Forum. Forum back in 2005, and I'm not sure from Forum who was there then. Forum came to us at VOLAC, we're a dairy nutrition business, and asked us to be involved in something called Dairy 2020. And it didn't take out much to work that it was about a vision to create a sustainable dairy industry by 2020. And it was really important because this was at a time when milk prices were falling rapidly. Everybody was having a really good bun fight in the dairy industry. And what we wanted to do was pull together a group of people who could talk about the challenges, the different scenarios for the dairy sector, and come up with some plan for the future. The point I want to make is it was a horrendous time where people were falling out. After doing the Dairy 2020 initiative, people seem much more comfortable about talking about the future and have a much better, clearer plan. So that process alone is very useful. It pulls people together. And that is an industry when we're all on the same side. So I was kind of inspired by Dairy 2020. So I was thinking one day, probably in the shower, thinking, do you know what, it'd be fantastic to do something on protein. Our business is all about whey protein. So I gave Forum a call and said, look, how about if we develop a collaboration on protein? And we came up with a question that says, how can we meet the protein needs of 9 billion people, world population, in a way which is affordable, healthy, and good for the environment? So that's the first point. Think of the right question you want to answer. The rest is history. We formed a collaboration. It took a long while to get people around the table, probably 2 years actually, but we had some global leaders, real big global leaders um, in the protein sector from very diverse perspectives. And ultimately, we produced a report called Future Protein, which was launched in the House of Lords in UK in 2016. That last point is really important because fundamentally, that is launched at the heart of government in the UK, where all policy makers were in attendance. So that's the power of this kind of collaboration and what it can do. I also believe it led to a step change in the way that businesses run their operations. I was immensely proud to be talking to someone that was a couple of 3 years ago, and they said, and they literally pulled up from their bookshelf behind them, I refer to that document in my business planning, and that was about 4 years after we'd finished it. So I was very proud of that. So none of this is anything to do with the FATS agenda. The reason why I wanted to take you on that story is that the FATS agenda, the FATS collaboration followed the same process, and I'm going to leave others to talk more in detail about it. I believe it's made a step change, although the folks from Forum have said read it. It doesn't take much reading because there's a lot of graphics there and it's very easy to analyze it from that perspective. So in the last few seconds that I have, I just wanted to summarize and say, look, where do I believe collaboration, working with Forum and others is so essential? Well, there's 4 things. Firstly, you do meet new people who have the energy and influence to affect change. Those 2 things are important, energy and influence. And if you haven't got those, don't get involved. I think the energy is the most important thing. Second point is, it is about understanding and respecting different perspectives to understand where we have common ground. I talked about that 80% common ground on the protein collaboration earlier on. That's the easiest place to start. Third point is understand where we can have most impact to solve global issues. So the whole process of doing this is to say, it really helps you focus down on where we can make material changes. What are the catalysts for change? Where can we focus? And then the final point is to ensure that you, your company, your organization are best informed to make effective strategic decisions for your business and indeed your industry. So thank you very much for your time. I'd like to now hand over to Lucinda Langton from Marks and Spencer's. Lucinda.
Thank you, Andy. And I'm sorry, I hope you can hear me. I'm sort of in the office and I haven't managed to find a meeting room. So yeah, really, M&S has been really strongly and very happy to participate in this report. And really, this has really helped us take forward our thinking in the space of fats and oils. As probably many of you know, we're a company that's been really strongly committed to sustainability for many years, and ultimately want to do the right thing for the environment, for people, since our Plan A commitments of 12, 14 years ago now. And one of those commitments we made was around the elimination of deforestation in our raw material value chains by 2025. So I think this report has really given us additional thinking. I think if I look at palm oil, this is really the area that I've been particularly been using it to think through. I mean, I joined the business about a year ago, and it was, I think, before I just joined, there was a debate internally about, you know, we are a relatively small user of particularly palm oil, but obviously a lot of customer pressure in this area. Do we or do we not? Do we move out of palm? Do we stay in palm? We could probably do it. You know, what would it mean? And actually, I think the decision was taken not to do so. And I absolutely, having read this and being part of the collaboration, it was the right decision, because I think this is about driving change across the whole fats and oils market in collaboration with many other stakeholders. So instead, the decision was made to go for 100. We've always been at 100%, or for a while been at 100% sustainable RSPO certified palm. But in the last year, we said, well, let's go 100% segregated. And actually, the big achievement has been we've got to about 99.6% of our palm oil now in our business is segregated and sustainable. So it's a really great. However, I think it's fair to say that the recent war in Ukraine has created huge volatility for us in our oil markets, and it's been much harder to maintain that sort of position. But I think that's really led us to have to collaborate and to work a lot more closely with our suppliers on the way that they obtain oils and we obtain oils. And sometimes, in some cases, we've had to switch between oils for our recipes. But in reality, hopefully we will reach a period of I was about to say stability. I think it's sustained volatility, but one that we manage differently. We continue to manage in that way. So we can continue to put the products that everyone loves on their tables. So in all of this, I think it's fair to say we remain entirely committed to sustainable sourcing of oils, in particular segregated sustainable. I think reality is therefore we need more of this and more new ways of doing sustainable fats and oils. We need more accredited sources. So for example, we've started to work with Forever Saba as a smallholder project in Malaysia to help more smallholders gain RSPO accreditation. And I think the big piece for me, and I know we touched on it right at the beginning here, is that the bit that's really exciting, I think, is how do we do this sustainably in the future? What does regenerative farming, what does regenerative palm look like? What does it mean? What have we got to get to? And what do those new farming systems look like that mean that we can all have a much broader range of sustainable oils to use and pull obviously those sustainability standards right through the whole fats and oil system. So that was really what I was going to say. We're really strongly committed. Volatility hasn't stymied that commitment. We're still committed to sustainability, and I look forward to working again on what that sustainable regenerative farming system for fats and oils looks like in the future. That was really it from me.
And Helene.
Hi, everyone. My name is Helene van der Homberg from IUCN National Committee of the Netherlands. And I will use some slides, and I hope they can be inviting. They're helping me as a mind map to organize my thoughts, and I hope it can invite you to share yours. The importance of addressing the multiple connections between biodiversity and vegetable oils, and also among the vegetable oils and their impact on biodiversity in return. Moving on. Very shortly, Forum asked me to say how did we get involved. In the beginning of the talks about sustainable soy, we must say we started in Netherlands talking to companies, and all these talks with other actors, so many other actors, led to standard setting, for example, in the Proterra or the roundtable on responsible soy. And right now we try to also set the agenda a little bit in the Collaborative Soy Initiative, for example, and elsewhere, on the importance in combining tools for impact. I'll certainly get back to that. Observing roundtables, advising, knowledge providing on benchmarking between standards, convening of platforms, Dutch soy platform, Collaborative Soy Initiative. It's an independent function, I have to say, but it came from our involvement earlier on. Advising government earlier on biofuels, currently on deforestation and due diligence policies, and business and finance on their agricultural policies. So, and surely reflecting along with you about sustainable futures, among others, international protein transition or energy transition, and what is the role of oils in that. Moving on. So very shortly, diving over an earlier report of IUCN in 2018, scientifically looking at what the impacts are or could be on species and ecosystem conservation by palm oil. Okay, not just the orangutan, also the gibbon, the tiger, the elephant, the chimpanzee, and the monkeys are important in that, of course. So it is important, it's very localized, and that also counts for other crops such as soy and other. Next one, please. So what is important also for the other oils is that we have to turn around the potential impacts not only by deforestation and conversion of ecosystems, but also issues of smoke and haze, use of fire, peatland drainage or soil depletion, human-wildlife conflicts, and water quality and availability or soil fertility and invasive species. Turn it around into positive interventions that could lead to biodiversity positive or regenerative practices. Next one. So down to the ground, an example of palm oil, we can also talk about regenerative soy, which is far from the actual situation. But in palm oil, for example, and other productive landscapes, better management of biodiversity over the whole, more ecological connectivity between nature areas, a better management of soil diversity, fresh water management, and in this case, of palm also leaving the understory there, managing the understory to be biodiverse. And issues like hunting and fishing, of course, are also important. Just to mention an example of biodiversity management on the spot. It's a matter of location, not on in primary forests, peatlands, etc. It's a matter of scale. It should be doable for a country also to manage. I mean, in Indonesia, it has grown out of its borders, you could say, with around 20 million hectares of concessions. That is out of manageable scale, you could say, but also the biodiversity management on the spot. Next one, please. So it has been said, palm oil here probably is here to stay for its features, but also because of its productivity. And that doesn't mean that we can claim palm oil from everywhere, because we have to manage the impacts also on human rights, etc. But it is very productive, and that is important to take into account on a global perspective. The global demand will rise. It can also be limited by consumption reduction, but it will rise, and then it's important. A small disclaimer here, soybean oil, yes, but it also provides a feed, meal, etc. So it is a bit of a nuanced picture here, but palm oil is certainly here to stay, and sustainable palm oil should be the answer. Next one, please. So through the world market that's very volatile, as it rightly stated, and especially right now, biomes are connected. The Cerrado and the Chaco and the Amazon and the tropical rainforests that we just showed for palm oil and other crops, they're connected. So species are somehow connected through the world market. Thank you. Next. Next slide, please. Yes, so and it's getting more increasingly complex, you could say, also by the disruptions mentioned. I don't even mention climate change here, but of course it plays a huge role. It affects productivity, for example, and so they will shift to other areas where there's more production. There is a large mutual substitution potential, of course, with technical limitations. But there is a large substitution potential, which means that the markets will, they are strongly connected. They react to each other's prices. There's these geopolitical and regulatory influences, for example, soy, the US and China having a conflict that shifts the sourcing. Palm oil issues in Indonesia, opposing also the EU dominant view on the sustainability of palm oil, both being part of the actual regulation in the EU, where sunflower and coconut, for example, are not in, or other oils, maybe also less risky, but it's also a fact that, a crop in itself, it's not a risk. It is the way, it is where it's located, and it's the way it's managed. Thank you. Next one. So next slide, please. So hitting the target with policies, either company policies or government policies, is quite complex. How to have the right impact. Next one, please. And there's a few things I'd like to give along here for further dialogue. Sustainability criteria, land use planning, and biodiversity are important for all the crops, also the smaller ones, the more sympathetic ones in the public opinion. They need sustainability management. Also, for example, in plant-based diet scenarios, where the oils also have a role to play. A reality check, though, we're nowhere near sustainability 2.0 or 3.0 and less to 4.0. So it's very important to strive for it, but we also have to pay sufficient attention to the do no harm agenda as it still goes on. So we have to conserve biodiversity, restore biodiversity in landscapes that have been suffering. So in this, I think that hiding behind the dikes, and this is of course a Dutch expression, is not always the right answer to more localized production or so. We are in this together as a globe. We're in this together. So the farmers in Brazil or in Bolivia and in Indonesia or in Cameroon or Ghana are also part of our journey. And let's look at the land use realities. Last slide, please. So yes, let's set the bar on sustainability, but invest also in the floor of good governance across the globe. So with strict criteria maybe, but also having positive impact on risk landscapes, particularly on biodiversity, on the climate, and on the people working and living there. So in that, we need sticks and we need carrots. We need to invite also producers to be part of that journey with payments for ecosystem services, sustainability linked loans, interesting sustainable business models with attractive market access for them to join the journey. So, and in that we've learned from both palm oil, I think, and soy that smart mixes are needed. Tailor-made toolboxes for hybrid governance between government and between other stakeholders to join hands. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much indeed to our panel. So it's interesting the themes that come across. Everyone is saying we need a different range of innovations, and everyone is saying these issues are so interrelated. That it seems to me that the palm and soy conversations a few years ago were very siloed, and that has really moved on to recognize these interrelations. We're going to spend the rest of our time thinking about how to go forward. What are the innovations, the solutions? We're going to go into breakout groups and get ideas from people. But Andy, I know we're going to lose you. So before we do, can I just ask you 2 questions? Yeah, 2 very quick ones, and then we'll move into our groups, and then we'll come back to some of the other discussions and questions in 10 minutes. Firstly, you talked about collaboration. Do you think it's particularly difficult or particularly important in edible fats and oils compared to other parts of the food system? And secondly, could you just comment on how VOLAC is looking at these innovative new fats and oils? Are they on you? How much are they on your radar? Because that's obviously going to be part of our discussion for the next half hour. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. I thought you wouldn't let me off the hook. So I think 2 things. One is the fats and oils collaboration was no different to the other ones. It followed the same process. It wasn't more or less challenging. I mean, protein had its real challenges as well. I think the only slight difference we had was, as you pointed, palm is very much more in the crosshairs than some of the other ones, and therefore we had to be very careful to not just focus on palm and look at it holistically, which is what you've done. So I think that's the only difference, to be fair. How are we looking at it, VOLAC? Well, our main products that we produce are fat products for animal nutrition, dairy cows. And what's been really interesting is that I think we look at fats and oils from a fractions point of view. So we look at the fractions within it, and I'm not an expert, but your C16s, your C18s, in terms of animal nutrition. And what's interesting is there's a lot of evidence that actually, unlike some people think, it doesn't produce saturated fats in the livestock that some people think it does. So that's not for now. But what I'm saying is, we've been looking at it very technically to look at the nutritional output of looking at different fractions of farm, and that's been a fascinating journey, and it's still continuing. Does that answer your questions, Caroline?
Yeah, thank you. I wish we had longer to talk about what happens if you put the technical perspective and the transformative narrative mindset shifting together.
Yeah.
But I think we probably don't have time to ask you that.
No, I mean, the only thing I would say is I think there's two powers that are pulling. One is the innovative, the technical. What is the role of palm, particularly at these sort of the micronutrient level, also the fraction level. But the other opposing power is, consumer. There were so many people who are trying to vilify palm. I'm not sure whether that is going to be stronger than the technical arguments that we're able to put forward that convince people that it's an important oil. Yeah, and I've talked about, there we go, I've talked about oil for palm oil for the last 4 minutes, so that's why we have to be careful. But I just think it's the balance between mass hysteria and mass view versus a technical, nutritional, fine-tuned story.
That's really interesting, that polarity. And I think as Forum, we would say there's also polarity between the carry on as we are, doing less damage, and the let's really transform the system and not assume it's about the
There's a reality.
But something more transformative, really rethinking how the value chains or the ingredients or the consumers work. We are going to just pause and go into smaller groups so that everyone can contribute to this conversation. I know we've got a great question from Jennifer about innovation in the chat already, and some other ideas that we want to pull through. But I'd like to pause so that you're not all just sitting listening to other people. In smaller breakout groups, the first question for every group is, what challenges are you experiencing or have you witnessed in enhancing sustainability or regeneration in edible fats and oils during the recent disruption? So what challenges to sort of get you going? And then a couple of groups are going to look at what changes you think are needed in business models, procurement, supply chains. So in the functioning of how these chains work, what innovations do you suggest to make that system resilient in the long term? And the other couple of groups are something a bit more at a higher level. How do we need to challenge our assumptions, our mindsets, and think differently to unlock that change? We're just talking with Andy about the technical perspective, other changes we need in how we're approaching the problem. So we'll jump straight into groups now. Thank you very much for that, Maria. We've got maximum 15 minutes. We'll give you a warning to bring you back. We'll share a few ideas and bring out some of the other thinking on innovations before we finish. So see you in less than 15 minutes. Thank you. Great. Welcome back. So I wanted to know if anyone that got something really burning from that session, either something you contributed or something you heard, something that struck you as important and worth sharing beyond the few people that were in your group. So the first question was on what challenges have you encountered recently? And would anyone like to share a challenge that they had? Yeah, anyone got a challenge to share?
Caroline, can I try?
Go ahead, thank you.
Adrian, you're here from Earthworm Foundation. So I think during the peak of the Ukraine and Russian conflicts, there's a lot of rush to change sourcing countries and geographically. It sounded easy on paper, but on reality, it's proven to be very much difficult. Although the supply, the volume is there in terms of oil palm, but the difficulty and challenges was the logistics parts, how the oil are being packed, the soap noodles are being packaged, what size, which kind of road truck they can fit on. There's some buying countries who have to build new silos, new tankers to accommodate this change of supply chain logistically. So on paper, you can switch volume to geographically, but on the logistics side, it can be a logistical nightmare. Caroline.
Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, so really interesting how substitution isn't that easy. And if we think about the ongoing disruption ahead, that's going to get more and more complicated. Any other challenges that anyone had? What you really want to share?
I think, Caroline, in our group, we were talking about agriculture, particularly in the UK, and the weather we've had this year. And although a lot of farmers managed to get a reasonable harvest this year, thinking about putting an oilseed rape for next year has been a real challenge when the ground was rock hard, there was no rain forecast, and then you don't know what's going to happen going forward. So even though it's been okay-ish this year, those ongoing uncertainties are something that's really come to the fore.
Yeah, thank you. And that's also going to continue. Let's move to the second question about innovations in the value chain, in procurement, in business models. Did either of the groups that were discussing that, is anyone who is in one of those groups have something they thought was really useful to share with the wider group? In that case, I'll ask the forum facilitators who are in those groups. What were a couple of gems that came up?
So in our group, we were talking about business can take more action when regulated. So is there need for more regulation to provide quicker action that's needed? And looking at policies for sustainable oils, localized, if you think about it in a more localized regional context, different oils are sustainable in different situations. So just having a better understanding of that. And then we had a chat about novel oils and lab-grown palm and commercialization to build capacity to be able to develop those different oils and then looking at how they compare. That's just some of ours.
And in our group, I think echoing some similar themes, this basic question of the bottom line and how do you reconcile sustainability and the long-term thinking and the systemic thinking that through which sustainability makes perfect sense. How do you reconcile that with the bottom line that's looking for maximization of profits? We heard the beginning of a comment which was unfortunately cut off, but I think was really going in the direction of this can't just be driven by sustainability teams alone in corporations, as well-intentioned as people are, unless there's a shift in understanding by consumers and seeing more consumers driving and asking for change. And then finally, there was a call for just getting out of the silo-driven thinking around this so far, the kind of silos that say, we're just going to move away from palm towards someone else, but don't necessarily see the interconnectedness of issues. So just the importance of joined up thinking at all levels.
And for me, it was a lovely example of how narratives change. We had Rainforest Alliance in that group, who I first encountered in the 90s when they just, get out of palm, get out of palm. And now Rainforest Alliance person was saying, it's such a problem that people think it's all about getting out of palm. These things do spin around, but they take a while for the narratives to change across the sector. So on that on the question of narratives, for the third question, the second set of groups, any gems to share about how we need to think about this question differently?
Caroline, I can feed off the point from before, actually, because one of the key things that came up in our group was also like a different approach to collaboration, that we actually need some quite different perspectives in the room, and that part of that is also bridging geographical divides, that we have certain perspectives easily sat here, but that we've got to start understanding different geographical perspectives on this, and part of that is also grappling with kind of some of the unintended consequences of the decisions we make, and start questioning, for example, the role we may have played in how smallholders can currently access the market, and sort of grappling with some of those questions. And then I suppose the other thing we did talk about was building that wider view of nutrition and sort of going beyond individual ingredients to really looking at whole dietary shifts, and that things like credible sort of nutritional eco-labeling may not actually play so much of a role in shifting consumer behavior, but will be perhaps really important for shifting business behavior and understanding around some of these issues. So those were a couple of key things that came up in our group.
Yeah, thank you. Jennifer, if you're there, you had a question in the chat before about driving innovation, R&D in innovation, and you said particularly in feed. I wondered if you'd like to come online and put your question, because I wanted to ask both Lucinda and Helene how their organisations are thinking about RMS thinking about this agenda of the innovations, and IUCN, how is IUCN thinking about work on these coming forward? But Jennifer, would you like to state the question yourself?
Sure, and I'm sorry for the people in my breakout room, because we already kind of discussed this a little bit. But you know, my question is that RSPO is quite imperfect, and regenerative agriculture, we support it tremendously, but it at scale is not going to produce enough oil for all the reasons we talked about, for growing populations and growing demand. So what can industry do to support the development of novel oils, biotech, which is just personally where the space I live in, with collaboration and joint ventures and funding to increase the R&D around feedstock development, which is really the big, the big question, as well as capacity building. And so that's my question, like, how do we engage companies who have really the most power and the most money to move that conversation forward?
Well, I might not have answers, but would love to hear Lucinda, any thoughts on that? And also Helene and Fiona, I'm going to come to you in a second, but if you have any thoughts on that, I was going to ask you something different, but yeah, Lucinda first. Any thoughts on that big question for Jennifer?
So I think I think it's fair to say we're doing a lot of this, absolutely. M&S, big, strong innovation pipeline, looking at lots of this. I can't disclose any detail, but the reality is we have partners with lots of, we have partnerships with particularly some companies in this space, and we're looking all the time at how can we build resilience in our supply chains, and how can we bring new fats to market that retain some of the same properties of the brilliant properties of palm oil without some of the environmental challenges. But you're right, even with them, it comes to questions around feedstock and where that comes from, and is it more sustainable, which is why my point in our breakout group was that, you know, we need to actually understand as well the carbon footprint of some of these different alternatives and get a level playing field of comparison between them. So yes, the answer is we're absolutely looking at it, and we see it's fundamental to the future of our food business.
Thank you. Helene, would you like to share any thoughts on
that? Yes, please. First, reacting to the issue that RSPO isn't perfect and regenerative practices won't feed the world, and then something about the innovative oils, which I'm less familiar with. We agree that, you know, in the field, particularly because on paper it is quite a strong standard in our view, that it has to be improved in terms of implementation, but that's quite a challenge in certain governance circumstances. So I sometimes think that criticizing the tool that has done it's so much its best and better than anything else so far is not always the right thing to do, but improving governance by combining tools such as RSPO with landscape programming, with capacity building of small farmers, with land use improvements, etc., is the thing to do in countries like Indonesia, because just leaving them behind, let's say, by choosing for other options, it won't solve local problems either. But yes, the part of the market will have to be filled also with very land, how would you say, even landless options, I'd say. So yes, we will have to also look into that, and I'm less familiar with it. But what I know is sometimes they don't get through the R&D dead valleys or so, because it's not attractive enough yet, and it should be made more attractive to invest in it, because we do need landless options for consumption. So I hope that answers some of the
Thank you, Helene. I have to share one exciting thing before we go. Before I jump to that, sorry, Ruben, I'm not sure we'll have time, because Fiona, I think you had something interesting about trade-offs. Just wanted to hear from you, because you've been in some quite interesting corporate positions in this space. And then I want to talk about a very exciting initiative before we'll dive off in 3 minutes.
Yeah. So much to say in so little time. I think the thing I'd like to focus on too is that I totally agree that RSPO isn't perfect. No certification scheme is perfect, and I think we also need to remember that the certification schemes were created as a transition, as a bridge to good foundational governance at a national policy level. And that should still fundamentally be the goal. We mustn't ever lose sight of that. And I think there's something about helping, you know, who can help, what organisations can help business to actually start to understand where governments are achieving tipping points in moving their own land management policies to better places. And I'm speaking with very different hats on here. You know, I'm responsible for policy in Backabor. I used to be in retail. I've been in the board of our SPO. I'm also the vice chair of the Sumatran Orangutan Society. So, you know, these issues are incredibly material to me, and trying to really look at how you drive change on the ground through multiple different approaches is massively challenging. So sorry, that was a bit of a very general thing, but let's not forget that the ultimate accountability is for governments, and that the more that we can also support and incentivize them, and sometimes that actually means making some short-term concessions in terms of what you accept, and the perfect, not good, not perfect kind of approach, for the sake of giving them breathing space if they're showing the right commitments and ambitions. But business and institutions need to be able to measure whether that actually, whether it's just greenwash that we're being told, or whether that actually is having effective impact on the ground. Takes time, but you know, what's the trajectory, and is it working?
Thanks, Fiona. That's a great point. Forum comes from a systems change point of view and looks at how a system works. And it's so easy to think about what we all do, and we can do certification or we can do transparency. But the point you made, it's supposed to shift something else in the system about governance and governments. And we actually need to think about the dynamics of the system and how functions change over time, and just having transparency on its own doesn't change the system.
Governments, you know, the financial system, the economic system, all that stuff, you know, are we really leveraging that adequately? And there's something about as citizens as well as consumers.
So on that point, we talked about this collaboration that sort of finished in this report. We have a new collaboration developing, which is really about future facing and is looking at these big questions of how do we navigate disruption. You had this lovely phrase, sustained volatility, Lucinda. How do we go from stability to sustained volatility? We have an initiative called The Future of Value Chains, grand title, reimagining the future. And we know that value chains are changing. We also know that they need to change because there are still all kinds of negative impacts. And we also know that doing that in silos isn't going to be good enough. So we need to take a real future-facing approach to navigating how they can be transformed. That's governance in value chains, that's roles at different players, that's the products. We're starting off looking at some individual commodities, but we know that we can't focus on individual commodities in their silos. So I just want to finish this by saying this is where we are going next. Wherever you are going next, I hope this conversation, this report is useful. But if you would like to join the conversation on reimagining future value chains across a range of different commodities and thinking about how they have to develop in this increasingly disrupted world, we would love to hear from you. We'll be sending out an email after this event to thank people and give you the links. And please do reply to us if you'd like to come back on that. And with that, Ruben, I'm so sorry we didn't come to your point, but I think we have to let people go. So huge thank you for participating, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.